You going to be going first?
Lauren and Jared are up, and I'm here just to answer questions around agency AMR and around process.
Okay, and who's up first then?
We are live.
Okay. It's all right, Chair Bray. I would be happy to lead off and then pass to Lauren. And we've kind of prepared a joint presentation just with some initial context setting slides, but I think we want to reserve most of the time for discussion and continuing follow-up from the earlier presentation from Secretary Moore.
Great. All right. So, Mr. Duval, the floor is yours, and then we'll go to Ms. Oates.
Thank you.
I'm here. I'm just apparently been shut off. My camera's been shut off, so by the host.
All right. Well, Jude can probably flick that back on. All right. All right. So, Mr. Duval, take it away.
Thank you, Chair Bray. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. While wait for that to change, I'll just introduce, oh, it says I'm a co-host now, so I think I can go ahead and share my screen. Folks see that in full screen?
Looking
Great.
good.
So
Yes.
Just to introduce myself again, I am here in my capacity as a member of the Climate Council. Those kind of roles on the left there are the roles that I have played on the Climate Council. And I just want to reiterate that while I have previously presented before this committee as Executive Director of the Energy Action Network, and that is my day job, I'm not here in that capacity because the nonprofit organization does not take policy positions, and either for the organization or on behalf of our very broad and diverse network. So my testimony and conversation here today is in my capacity solely as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, in which I have had to take those types of positions. But it's great to be with you again, and thank you for the invitation. Lauren.
Thank you, Jared. I'll do my intro again too. My name is Lauren Oates. As I mentioned earlier this morning, several of you know me in my capacity with the Nature Conservancy, but like Jared, I'm here today solely in my capacity as a Climate Council member and member of the steering committee from the Senate appointees bucket that Jared and I both fill. As I said, it looks like, if you're looking at the screen right now, it looks like I'm as many words long as Jared, but I want to acknowledge that he actually sat on 2 subcommittees and was co-chair of 1 too. So big kudos to Jared for all the work that he did. I'm here largely to talk about the resilience and adaptation components of the Climate Action Plan in my capacity as the person there to represent climate resilience and adaptation to natural hazards. I sat on the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. I should say I sit, since we're still meeting occasionally here and there. And I think, Jared, we have a quick slide just as a placeholder for reflections on process. Jared, do you want to keep sharing, or do you want to?
I'll drop it for now, Lauren, and then we can bring it back up.
Okay. So Secretary Moore did a really, really good job. He spoke very eloquently to the process to date. Jane's here to continue to answer any questions from the agency perspective on process, but Jared and I wanted the opportunity to give our perspective as Senate appointees and have been part of the process in different subcommittees, which were all run relatively differently, as well as our role in the steering committee. I'd first like to acknowledge the thoughtfulness of the General Assembly and the development of the Global Warming Solutions Act, especially with respect to how they wanted to seat and chair those 23 member seats. Though Secretary Moore eloquently mentioned earlier that there's an apparent lack of diversity, both geographic and otherwise, we still did do a pretty good job, or you all did, in appointing us. We have Iris Chung, who is a 17 or 18-year-old high school student, and she sat on 2 subcommittees and was an active participant of the council while also finishing high school and applying for college. I mentioned earlier that the state climatologist, Dr. Leslie Ann Dupini-Giroux, was part of the process as well. We had a working active organic dairy farmer, and Abby Course, and obviously all the way to Secretary Moore, who I think might have been one of, if not the only people who managed to read the full nearly 300-page plan in the 2 weeks that we had. So just gratitude for all of the work that we collectively did and the time that we had to do it. I also want to acknowledge the complexion and the depth and breadth of time that was invested by the subcommittee members. The subcommittees were again structured relatively differently. We had different scopes and charges that we were responsible for creating. I again sat on the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and sat in a couple of others, largely just listening in to some of the other subcommittees as they were developing their actions and strategies. But you heard Secretary Moore earlier, and I'm sure Jared will speak to it too, the theme of time over the course of the past year. Oftentimes that was discussed as the lack of time to do this well and do it right, with the intent and attention that was needed, as Secretary Moore said, acknowledging the need to balance the need for robust participation and development of thoughtful solutions with the obvious need for necessary and immediate action to meet the needs of our time. I also just acknowledging the time that it took to get it done, that what was asked of the counselors and subcommittee members and robust state staff participation. It turned into a very colossal lift for the past year. And we did it in a remote setting, as you all are having to do your 2.5 session now, at least now remotely. And building coalition that way is challenging. And I just want to acknowledge how difficult and yet impressive it was that we were able to build the coalitions that we did and make space for the important conversations that were both challenging and exciting over the course of the past 13, 14 months or so. I want to acknowledge that I think Jean dropped in the chat earlier a link to some signing statements that several of the counselors presented. I co-signed one of them with several other counselors and just acknowledging the need for further discussions and refinements necessary to meet the calls of the guiding principles that our Just Transition Subcommittee created rather, and acknowledgement that a key piece of the work that is necessary in accomplishing robust climate action is deep investment in and support of our workforce and its continued development and training. And Secretary Moore spoke to that too, but that is something that needs to be discussed further and refined, especially as we have a changing, ever-changing and shifting demographic in the state. And then finally, just acknowledging that I look forward to our shared continued work in this space. The Senate appointees were appointed for 3-year terms. This is a very iterative process. I kind of picture this as a ball passing back and forth between the council and the legislature. We created a plan with a lot of good ideas for you all to take and carry. And as you need further refinement of them, I welcome you to pass those back to us and ask for us to do the hard work in getting them closer to the finish line. So I think that's probably enough on process from me, Jared. I welcome you to take the floor now.
Thanks, Lauren. I would reiterate much of what Lauren said. I think, first on the time piece, that there was a massive amount of commitment that went in. I mean, many counselors for whom I just want to give folks a sense of how much care and deliberation and depth of work went in. It was basically a second full-time job for many of us. And I just want to pause to recognize that I can see kind of two things that sound opposite, but I think are true at the same time with regard to the timeline. On the one hand, we have heard that putting together a statewide plan that basically addresses the entire state of Vermont, our entire economy, was short, certainly from the perspective of being able to deeply engage as many Vermonters from as diverse communities geographically, demographically as we would have wanted. That of course was a challenge, especially during a pandemic, and we are committed to doing more as a council, recognizing that this is a standing council and we have a lot more work to do. At the same time, I think it's also, there was a real feeling of urgency, and a year timeline was appropriate in many ways in the context of the legislature first having set goals for emissions reduction in 2007, and for almost a decade and a half, missing them year after year after year, because there, up until last year, there was not a legal requirement to actually meet those targets until the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so while there has been good work on climate and energy, in particular in Vermont over the last decade and a half, especially in our electricity sector and in our efficiency sector, we have missed those targets because we lacked that key piece of a requirement that the Global Warming Solutions Act provided, and because we have not had focused real policy frameworks and regulations focused on our two most polluting and highest cost sectors, which are transportation and heating. And so I think this climate action plan is really the first time that the state now has the options on the table. And I will say very clearly, I don't think that this plan guarantees that we will meet the legal requirements. I think it gives us a very strong opportunity to do so. But whether or not Vermont meets the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements will depend in large part on which of those recommendations the legislature takes up and advances. The same with the administration. I want to focus my remarks shortly on some of the way that Lauren and I had agreed to divide this up is I'll focus a lot in the first part on the pollution reduction and meeting the emissions reduction requirements, both because that's kind of more of my expertise and background, and I served on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. I'll primarily focus on energy, both because that's what I know best, and because that's where over 3/4 of our climate pollution and the vast majority of our costs come from in this. And then I think Lauren will talk more about agriculture and adaptation and resilience. So let me go back to sharing I will say that some of what I'm going to share, as Lauren mentioned, is in those signing statements. I also wrote one to really highlight what I thought the plan represented and what are some of the important next steps to make sure that it is successful in meeting the goals and requirements that the legislature set out. But let me just go ahead and set some context. You know, I always start with the science and the data. And as we know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us we have less than a decade by 2030 to cut our greenhouse gas pollution in half. I do want to note, you know, Secretary Moore included in her slides this phrase, cutting emissions in half by 2030. But, you know, careful readers of the Global Warming Solutions Act will note that the target for 2030 is actually a 40% reduction below 1990 levels. While the Climate Action Plan was being developed, President Biden announced a national target of cutting emissions in half by 2030 nationally. I don't want to get in too far into the weeds on this, but I do want to note that the question came up, how different is that than Vermont's goal? And it's really not different because the baseline matters. So Vermont's 40% reduction below 1990 levels is from that 1990 baseline, which was the lowest measured emissions that Vermont has had in the last almost three decades. Whereas the target that we have in both the Global Warming Solutions Act for 2030 and 2050, and that President Biden was mentioning, was a baseline of reducing emissions below 2005 levels, which was the second highest level of emissions that Vermont has had in almost the last 3 decades. So these baseline numbers can get confusing. I just want to say in shorthand, cutting our emissions in half from 2005 levels basically ends up the same total statewide amount of emissions as reducing 40% below 1990, because those baseline years are so different. But big picture story, reduce pollution in half by the end of this decade. We had goals that were in statute, but they were missed every year because we were missing some key policy frameworks and the type of requirements that the Global Warming Solutions Act provided. I think we all know that no state or country alone can solve the climate crisis, but I think most of us also know that we all have a responsibility to do our part. And that responsibility is elevated for places like Vermont that have long used fossil fuels. We have the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions in the entire Northeast. And we have contributed more to the problem of the global climate crisis than many others globally, especially island nations and poor countries. So of course we have a moral and legal responsibility. And there is also massive opportunity in that transition because our dependence on fossil fuel is incredibly harmful to Vermont consumers with high cost and price volatile heating and transportation costs, not to mention, of course, all of the health and other pollution-related costs to society that result from that. So my read on the Climate Action Plan is that it is a comprehensive plan that is a strong foundation for progress that gives us a really strong opportunity to meet the requirements. But again, whether or not we do so will depend on which of these recommendations get taken up, in what order, and given what priority. And I'm going to speak a little bit, and I'm just going to say this is on my own behalf. You can imagine that a council of 23 members, in order to achieve the level of consensus we did on many recommendations and to end up in a 19-4 vote, there were many recommendations included in taking that final step of saying this should be done first, this second, and assigning an even more specific level of priority would have been difficult given the kind of timing and dynamics. But I do feel that I have a responsibility as the person appointed to provide energy and data analysis, who's been looking at a lot of the modeling, especially as a co-chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee and as a member of the cross-sector subcommittee, to say what I think, based on the data and analysis I've reviewed, are some of the most important things for attention this year by the legislature and administration. And I think if we do, again, there is the opportunity not only to reduce pollution, but to help Vermont consumers and strengthen the Vermont economy for reasons we have discussed many times in the past. I'm happy to discuss more, and you will all see further analysis about that when the final CADMIS and EFG, the consultants that were hired by the Climate Council to provide the pathways analysis, which will include some economic modeling, and that will be forthcoming. Jane can provide more detail on when that will be available. So just, context, again, this is historic emissions. The green dots show the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements of where we need to get to. This is another view that I think really helps illustrate the importance of focusing on, there's a lot of focus and conversation on electricity as a regulated sector, but the largely unregulated sectors of transportation and thermal are where the vast majority, almost 3/4 of our emissions come from. And a big part of this climate action plan is recommending policy and regulatory frameworks to focus here, both for pollution and energy cost saving reduction reasons. So there were two, as I think Senator McDonald, Senator McCormick rightly noted, there's 234 action steps in this plan. Can you please highlight what are some of the higher impact ones that, either in terms of policy or regulation, are especially important? The two highest in the plan, in terms of the analysis that I and others have done, I won't say this on behalf of the whole council, this is more presentation that I am doing at this point, that probably the most important recommendation here from an emissions reduction perspective is implementing a clean heat standard. It is designed as proposed to ratchet down over time fossil fuel use and pollution from our heating sector by providing credit for things like weatherization and switching to cold climate heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and B100 biodiesel and sustainable wood pellet heating, things that can really help Vermonters stay warm with clean heat, save money by having their homes and buildings more efficient, and and really, focus. That is the primary proposed. There are other policy recommendations, regulatory recommendations, and it can be difficult to pull one out and analyze it on its own because these things are so interlinked and depend on each other. So for instance, in order to do a lot of the switching of home and building heating systems away from highly polluting, high cost fossil fuels to clean heating, a lot more opportunities get opened up when those buildings have been weatherized and become more efficient. So the clean heat standard works much more effectively and efficiently when it's paired with an effort like weatherization at scale, which I will address shortly. But if I'm just speaking as designed, as proposed, and I will put in the chat after I've finished speaking, the white paper that a working group has put together on a proposed clean heat standard model design for consideration by the legislature. I will share that link after, but that is really the number one action in terms of policy, in terms of what can achieve a significant level of emissions reduction in Vermont. That's 34% of the needed total by 2030 as designed. The second, sorry, go ahead, Senator Bray.
Thanks. And just so to remind committee members, we've talked about this a little bit, and so that you know, based on that white paper, we drafted a clean heat standard bill. And although it's the House that's going to, by plan, go first, I wanted to make sure that we weren't just waiting for the House to do something. So we have, I don't know how similar they are exactly, but we will take some preliminary testimony and sort of build up some momentum before the House bill ever comes over. So we know that's and for years we've talked about how a weatherized home and fuel switching or cleaner heat go hand in hand. So thanks for, but it's good to have something clear and crisp like a bill to be able to start working on it as opposed to discussing it year after year. So back to you.
I see Jane has raised her hand. Jane.
I was just going to offer that this is moving quickly in the House, obviously, and we're testifying both this afternoon and tomorrow morning on the clean heat standard with House Energy and Technology.
Great.
So next on the list, in terms of highest impact, and by highest impact, I mean, this is narrowly in terms of the emissions reduction requirements. There are other kind of impacts we, of course, want to achieve in terms of energy cost reductions, other cost reductions, improving the Vermont economy, equity, et cetera. And I think it's really important to note that all of these recommendations were assessed according to all of those criteria and more, and a just transitions framework, and the equity principles that are recommended in the are very important on each of these, but just especially because some of the questions that came up about what do we need to do to meet both the legal and moral requirement to achieve the emissions reduction, I just want to focus on that first. So number two would have been the Transportation and Climate Initiative. That was designed, that program was designed to achieve a 26% reduction in transportation sector emissions by among the participating jurisdictions. I would say, I think, I don't want to sound naive here, but the plan does explicitly say if and when regional viability exists for TCI, if Massachusetts or Connecticut changed their mind and decided to come back, or if another state decided to join, the recommendation of the plan is for Vermont to, at that moment, join TCI and have it become operational. And then the plan would add up and we would be able to achieve that scale of reduction. But we also recognize that that may not happen. It may be, that TCI is a thing of the past. And so we have a responsibility to figure out how do we make up that gap in emissions reduction. So I would say, you know, the next set of things that we look at are all vitally important, but none of which individually on their own rise to the level of emissions reduction impact as these two policies. So next.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
Thanks, Jared, for all this. So just to be clear, it doesn't make sense, and I apologize for my ignorance on this, for us to sort of be do TCI in any way on our own. So that's my first question. And then secondly, it sounds like your recommendation would be to put it in statute that once another New England state, says we're going to move forward or return to TCI, like Massachusetts or Connecticut, that putting it in statute would signal, I think, a good thing in that other states would realize they would have partners, and then secondly, we could again somewhat seamlessly, hopefully, move in that direction. Does that make sense? Those two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Campion, and I would defer to Jane at the Agency of Natural Resources on some of the questions related to TCI, if you want to add in, Jane. I know that Commissioner Walk has been really focused on representing Vermont in the TCI conversations, but my understanding is that it would not make sense for Vermont that in order for TCI to work as a regional cap and invest market and to have kind of program viability on an administrative level, there need to be multiple states signed up. And my recollection is that that's what the MOU between the TCI states, which also includes Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic states, not just New England states. DC was, as far south as Washington, DC was involved, that regional viability would be defined as at least 2 states participating. And so I do think if for the legislature to be consistent with the recommendations of the Climate Council, that would be that that Vermont moves forward with the Transportation and Climate Initiative when and if another state joins or that regional market viability exists. So yes.
And then if I may, what about so there's a memorandum of agreement, but is there something more significant by putting it in statute?
I think one of the key questions about statute is, as I have understood it, there's kind of 2 things that would have to happen concurrently for Vermont to join TCI. There would have to be a rulemaking process that would happen through Agency of Natural Resources, but there would need to be authority given by the legislature to receive and then expend the revenues that would come in through TCI because of the budgetary related component of TCI. I am not 100% sure. My understanding is that there are members of the House Transportation Committee that are considering language that if and when to basically say that Vermont should, that the legislature should authorize Vermont to receive and expend revenue if and when it becomes possible to join a regional cap and invest program, which I will note could be the Transportation and Climate Initiative. There is also another regional cap and invest program that has been focused much more broadly and is not just focused on transportation that Quebec, Nova Scotia, and California participate in, called the Western Climate Initiative. But either way, my understanding, and I would defer to legal experts and others on this call, that there would need to be statutory authority given to receive and expend revenues through any cap and invest system, similar to what happened when Vermont joined the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And if that was done, I think it would streamline and make it, it would avoid potential delays if that language was on the books and Vermont was ready to move if and when a state joined, that would be a very different situation than receiving the news that Massachusetts has changed its mind, or another Maine decides that this is a viable strategy. If we don't have that language available, and again, I'm speaking as an individual counselor, this was not a kind of unanimous point of unanimous agreement on the council, especially with some administration members. But I do think that we don't have a lot of time for delay. I want to speak just briefly to the timeline issue here. I want to underline that the emissions reductions requirements that Vermont has committed to by 2030 are nearly twice as aggressive for 2030 as they are for 2025. I think that there's a understanding that in the near term, especially with the ARPA, the federal money through ARPA and through the infrastructure bill, that we are going to have a significant opportunity to make investments that can help us meet that 2025 emissions reduction deadline. At the same time, my understanding of the ARPA funds eligibility, and this comes in part from Deputy Secretary of Administration Doug Farnham's presentation to the council, is that all ARPA funds need to be appropriated by 2024 and expended by 2026. And so if we don't think long-term about how to set up the policy and regulatory frameworks that provide that clarity going forward and provide sustainable funding mechanisms, we could be in a kind of lose-lose situation where in 2026, the funds to invest in this transition are running out from the federal government at exactly the time that we need to be ramping up our efforts to meet a twice as ambitious 2030 goal. And so I think what we have seen over and over again in the energy space, and we've seen this on weatherization, is that there's been this roller coaster of funding that has been dependent on the federal decisions. We saw that about a decade ago, and then there was a cliff that led to a drop-off in the number of weatherizations that was happening, led to layoffs and a lack of clarity for that sector. So I think what my recommendation would be to you is to think simultaneously about effective, cost-effective, high-impact investments of those ARPA funds in line with what the council recommended and the infrastructure funds, while at the same time looking ahead to figure out the policy and regulatory frameworks that need to be in place so we don't experience a cliff-like situation that inhibits our ability to keep making progress post-2025 and in that kind of second half of the decade. And on that question about policy and regulatory measures, the council has looked at many of these. I would kind of broadly lump them into kind of four categories of options. One, which we did not consider, it never really came up in any council discussion or any subcommittee meeting, is the option of carbon pricing or putting a tax directly on fossil fuels. I think that did not get addressed for a number of reasons. The primary one is that carbon pricing has been really, has historically proven ineffective at reducing fossil fuel use because people's demand for those fuels is highly inelastic. And it also can, unless there is policy action taken on the back end to address this, it can be very regressive, having lower income and rural folks paying a higher share of that transition, which is something that we do not want. So primarily what we have focused on instead of carbon pricing is three sets of strategies to explore. One is a cap and invest strategy, which unlike carbon pricing, gives you the clarity of setting an emissions reduction cap that declines over time so that we can be more assured that we meet the requirements. That is the model of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That was the proposed model of the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And that is the model of the Western Climate Initiative. So that is one suite of options, is cap and invest programs. Another that was looked at is performance standards. We're most familiar with this, of course, with our renewable energy standard. Most states in the country have set renewable portfolio standards that require a certain amount of renewable or carbon-free electricity purchases within their portfolio. And that is the model that the Climate Council ended up recommending as their primary strategy for the thermal sector, clean heat standard. That is a performance standard, which different than cap and invest. What cap and invest does is it says, here is the limit of emissions. It ratchets down over time. And the polluters, the fossil fuel suppliers, have to purchase allowances for those emissions. And then those funds go to the participating states to invest in emissions reducing activities. Instead, what performance standards do is they say to those same suppliers, you have to undertake a certain amount of activity that will result in emissions reduction. So that's what RGGI did. Clean heat standards would require those fossil fuel suppliers to either directly reduce their emissions by changing what they sell, or to purchase credits from others who are undertaking activities like weatherization, like heat pump installation, like wood stove changeouts that can help lead to emissions reduction. And that was kind of where we ended up on the thermal recommendation, was for a clean heat standard. I think on the transportation side, we're going to look at both of those again. TCI still needs to be kind of kept tabs on, and we need to be aware of what could happen there. But in its absence, we have been told, Vermont has been told by our neighbors to the north in Quebec, that it would be possible for Vermont to join the Western Climate Initiative, even if just to cover transportation fuel. So we need to explore that. I want to be clear, these are not recommendations of the council. These are not even my recommendations. What I'm saying is, in the absence of TCI, these are some of the primary drivers, the primary transportation policy frameworks that we have begun exploring, and that are the type of things that we need to do more research and analysis on, so that we can come back with transportation related policy recommendations later in this session. Another one that we will explore is the idea of a clean transportation standard, another performance standard, very similar to the clean heat standard, that has been implemented in states like California, Oregon, and Washington. So we will look at their experience there. It's also actively being considered by New York, Massachusetts, and other states. And then the kind of last bucket, and I should also note that none of these are mutually exclusive, and sometimes they actually work better in partnership. So for instance, California has a low carbon fuel standard, a performance standard on transportation fuels. They are also part of the Western Climate Initiative, and they also have are doing things like Vermont has now committed to do, which is setting performance requirements on manufacturers. So this is where, without TCI, the remaining highest impact transportation sector recommendation in terms of emissions reduction is joining Advanced Clean Cars 2, following California. I'm just going to say, that's the second part of this slide. What that would result in is 95,000 electric vehicles made available for sale in Vermont between model years 2026 and 2030. That many fossil vehicles that many electric vehicles replacing fossil vehicles would get us about 10% of the way to our 2030 emissions reduction requirements. But I do want to say that alone in and of itself is necessary but insufficient. That makes manufacturers make that number of electric vehicles available. But in order to ensure that number or more electric vehicles are purchased and used in replacing fossil vehicles, reducing pollution and reducing transportation costs for Vermonters, we also need to make sure that the kind of related policy and incentives are in place to support that, like charging infrastructure, like incentives and programs like Replace Your Ride and Mileage Smart, to especially help lower income Vermonters access those programs. So I just want to go back to say, those are some of the things that will need to be considered. There was a recommendation in the Climate Action Plan about implementing a vehicle efficiency price adjustment. But on this and on so many of these policies, the detail matters, and the amount of emissions reduction you can get, whether it's equitable, the economic benefit, the equity benefits of it, really come down to program and policy design. And you can imagine a vehicle efficiency price adjustment program that is set very low in terms of rebates and fees, that does not do much to change the market. You can imagine a much stronger program that plays a much larger role. And I think we're going to have to do analysis looking at what different levels and different kind of criteria for eligibility could result in for Vermonters in meeting our goals. I would also just say that, the other one that comes in as a high impact, which we had defined as 10% of our total emissions reduction or above, also at around 10% of the way to our 2030 emissions reduction requirements, is weatherization at scale. Weatherizing 90,000 low and moderate income homes in Vermont, both single family homes and apartments, would result in, assuming historic rates of fuel savings and emissions reduction and the average kind of heating supply that Vermonters are using, would result in about 10% of our emissions reduction. But of course, in order to do that, there will, in the short term, need to be an investment and focus of ARPA funds to enable that, but there will also need to be figuring out what is the long-term mechanism to fund that in the 2026 to 2030 period, especially, which, again, this relates to the clean heat standard. If a clean heat standard is passed, that could be the or a primary funding mechanism to enable that scale of weatherization. So with that, I'm just going to pause. I just really wanted to elevate some of from an emissions reduction perspective, some of the highest impact recommendations in the plan. Senator McDonald talked about a report card. If the question was asked of me, how will we know whether or not the climate action plan is on track to have a chance at success? The number one thing to me would be whether or not a clean heat standard is advanced this session, given that it is the mechanism to achieve about a third of what we need to do. I think the next thing would be whether or not we end up joining TCI, and if that is not possible, as seems likely now, if we are able to identify and pass one or more of these mechanisms, likely not this year, because we may not have these recommendations to you in the full policy analysis done until June, but likely next year. And in the meantime, the next set of recommendations that can achieve double-digit emissions reduction include weatherization at scale and advanced clean cars 2 and advanced clean trucks. And I'd note that my understanding, Jane, please correct me, is that the advanced clean cars 2 is going to happen regardless, that the agency is entering rulemaking, that there is no kind of statutory action needed by the legislature to ensure that that moves forward. So that's the clearest short-term win. Importantly, what that does is not just provide a certain amount of electric vehicles for sale in Vermont, a requirement on vehicle manufacturers. It also requires that all light-duty vehicles sold after 2035 have to be zero-emission vehicles. So it sends a really clear market signal to manufacturers as well. But with that, I don't want to take any more time, so I'm going to pass it over to Lauren.
Before we go, can I ask a couple questions? One is weatherization as a greenhouse gas reduction strategy. 10% is a meaningful number, but it's also a relatively modest number. I mean, well, I don't know what to call modest. 10% is still a lot of emissions. But the other thing and so let me just check with you to make sure my read on this is on target, or that isn't. Please help me learn what I'm missing. That although it's a relatively modest amount, it also creates the potential for more homes to be heated by cold climate heat pumps, because it reduces the heating load, and cold climate heat pumps generally inadequate in an unweatherized home, so that they go hand in glove. Is that still correct?
That's exactly right. And I would say that weatherization is probably one of the most important short-term strategies, because it is such a win across the board. It directly reduces emissions. It unlocks future emissions reduction potential by being able to, meet a larger share of heating by things like exactly you said, Chairman Bray, about cold climate heat pumps. It also provides all the benefits. There was a great study that was produced in coordination between the Agency of Commerce, the Department of Health, and the Public Service Department, talking about the health benefits of weatherization, indoor air quality, including, and then also, of course, when you reduce your heat load, you're reducing your energy costs. I can speak to this personally. I live in an old 1890 home. We had it comprehensively weatherized, and we cut our heating load and our heating bills in half at the same time as we went totally fossil free. So that was the first step for us, and I think that's the first step for a lot of other people. And if we're thinking about kind of the order of operations here, investing significantly early on in weatherization has all of those strong benefits, and that's why it was one of the main recommendations from the council for ARPA investment.
Okay, thank you on that side. On clean heat standard, in terms of drafting a bill in November, December, one of the challenges working from the white paper was there are many, many pathways, options, and a lot of nuance in that white paper. And I'm wondering about your read on, well, two things. One, is there a state that's already gone ahead so we have, or a country, whatever, that gives us a working model of this that we can look at? And because my concern was not so much that we would try to stand up such a program. My sense was that we always needed to rely on expertise across the street at the department and PUC to help develop a program. But before we turn a request over to them, we have to be crystal clear in terms of what we're trying to do. And given the number of options in the current form, at least as I understand it, I'm a little concerned about how much clarity we can bring in the next 4 months to a charge to be sent to the department and the PUC. So can you give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the clean heat standard proposal benefits from, this gets back to Senator Campion's question about learning from other states. It is unique in that it is a focus on stationary thermal fuels. But in terms of how it would work, it is very similar to the already operational low carbon fuel standards that exist in California, Oregon, and Washington state. And so much of the design is informed by that. It's also, I would say, informed by Vermont's experience in designing a renewable energy standard, including Tier 3 around fossil fuel reduction. And many of the administrative and technical knowledge, pieces of technical knowledge that will be important to implement a clean heat standard already exist or could be built on. So for instance, a clean heat standard would rely on independent, transparent, rigorous analysis of how much emissions reduction do you get on average by weatherization project or by heat pump water heater installation. And that work is already done by technical analysis group, the TAG, that exists both for characterizing the savings from efficiency measures to regulate and monitor our efficiency utilities, and that is the technical assistance group, the TAG, that exists to characterize measures for compliance with Tier 3 in terms of fossil fuel reduction. So while Vermont likely would be, there is a clean heat standard type proposal that has advanced in Colorado. I would say that's a little bit different because they are primarily natural gas for thermal fuel, and they don't have the same diversity and level of delivered fuels like fuel oil and propane we do. So our context is a little different, but they were the first on a clean heat standard. We would be the first kind of in our context. But I think it's very important to note that it's building on learning, example, expertise of other performance standards that already exist around electricity efficiency and transportation.
Great. And then my last question is bill that's coming into the committee end of this week, beginning of next, is on advancing the renewable energy standard tier 1 to 100% by 2030, and helping us deliver on making quote unquote beneficial electrification fully beneficial. The other attraction I see to it is that we've become more aware of equity, and the single tool in the toolbox that I see in terms of making every home a part of our clean energy future is that everyone get clean electricity when they turn on the power at their house. It's just one element of giving everyone access to a clean energy future, but it would seem like this one has the broadest sweep of everything available to us. So I don't know what kind of impacts just advancing basically from 75% to 100% gains us. I don't know if anyone has modeled that.
We have, and I should be really clear here that I'm speaking on behalf of the council, or in my role as a counselor, and not on behalf of EAN here, as I have been throughout. But EAN includes solar installers, weatherization contractors, fuel dealers, colleges and universities, and this is an area where we definitely do not have agreement across the network or even on the council. I would say that the council made very clear there was a recommendation to advance 100% standard for electricity that was either renewable or carbon free by 2030. But beyond that, in terms of details, in-state, out-of-state, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 levels, there was not details spoken to there. I would say that if the question is about can we achieve significant emissions reduction through an update to the RES, it is not nearly as high impact as these other strategies. Our electricity portfolio right now contributes only about 2% of our statewide emissions. We already have a policy and regulatory framework to ensure that those emissions decline over time, the existing RES. That can and should be improved as the council recommendation to move to 100% renewable or carbon-free suggests. But in terms of what it will deliver in terms of emissions reduction on its own, it is of a relatively small scale, especially compared to things like a clean heat standard or establishing finally a policy and regulatory framework in the transportation sector. I do think it becomes important longer term, though, as we do more to electrify our transportation and heating sectors, that we're doing as much as possible to make sure that electricity is as clean and low emitting as possible. Although I would say that already electrifying with Vermont's existing portfolio, or even if you just look at the ISO grid, we already achieve significant emissions reduction benefits by getting off of fossil fuel transportation and heating, both because of things like electric vehicles and heat pumps use energy so much more efficiently than internal combustion engines and boilers and burners. So there's less energy waste. And because the grid, whether measured by ISO New England or by Vermont's purchased portfolio, is so much cleaner relative to using gasoline or diesel or propane or fuel oil for heating. So that is a recommendation of the council, 100% clean, or I should say renewable or carbon-free electricity by 2030. But in terms of what it can do to help us achieve the 2025 and 2030 emissions, my personal view is that is more like an extra point than a touchdown. And the things here can deliver the greatest emissions reduction impact in terms of really making sure we're on track. But it should be a part of where we go, of course. I just am cognizant that in the past, when the RES has come up for deliberation, because of the inertia around that, because of the number of stakeholders there, it can take up all of the oxygen in the room. And it would be a tragedy if, at the end of this year or the end of next year, we're still in a point where electricity and efficiency are only sectors that have regulations and policy frameworks designed to reduce pollution and reduce costs. and we still had our two highest polluting and highest cost sectors without clear, effective policy and regulatory framework. So I would say, from a council perspective, from meeting the GWSA targets, I would beg of you to please make sure you establish and advance policy and regulatory frameworks in the transportation and thermal sectors at the same time as you consider improving the res.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hear you, and we'll try to walk and chew gum at the same time on this one. There's two things that about it, and then I'll leave it alone for the time being with the tier one, advancing tier one. One, as we continue to build load, it becomes more and more important that that load is clean load. And so we have the opportunity to anticipate that load by building towards a 100% clean portfolio by 2030, so that we get ourselves ready for that, the increased use of heat pumps and EVs. And then the other thing too, I think the last year has sharpened my sensitivity around equity and access. And a lot of people, there have been a number of initiatives, and they're relatively high costs for what they deliver, to bring, for instance, solar to lower income Vermonters. And so rather than doing it on a one-by-one basis with relatively high per unit costs, if you can convert the grid itself to 100%, you can ensure 100% coverage, and you can, I think, do it at the lowest possible cost per unit provided. So it's a little different than maybe if we talked 2 years ago, where I think I would have been thinking about greenhouse gas reductions near term rather than longer term. So, but I don't want to belabor the point. And so back to you.
Well, I want to ask Lauren to take it over from here.
Thanks, Jared. Before jumping in, I just want to acknowledge that we have about 30 minutes left. So and I want to be brief so that there's time to make space for questions at the end. So I just want to acknowledge up front that I'm more than willing and happy to come back if need be, if we're not able to get through this part of the scope of the climate action plan. And then I'd also like to offer up two, I think, relevant observations. And the first is that though Jared and I are only 2 of 23 counselors, it's pretty impressive that he and I represent both the energy emissions reductions side of the climate action plan work, as well as the natural resources adaptations piece. And the second observation is that actually mirrors pretty well members of this committee and your charge in both the natural resources sphere as well as the energy sphere. So I think, especially within this committee, what Jared and I are presenting to you today offers a lot of fodder for conversation and advancing policies that will help both our climate adaptation measures as well as those for emissions reductions. Earlier today in the morning session, Senator McDonald mentioned the need for medicine to our changing climate. I'd love to continue that analogy as I jump into the adaptation and resilience piece of this, and argue that, or make the case rather, that part of that treatment plan, if you will, should include or must include the necessary investment in adapting to climate change impacts that are both current and anticipated to continue to worsen over the course of the next several decades. That needs to be done alongside our necessary mitigation efforts, and they shouldn't be seen as separate. They shouldn't be siloed. The efforts need to be done in tandem. And I'd also want to remind folks in the committee that many of the actions that we can take to reduce emissions or to sequester and store carbon, for example, in mitigation, also have co-benefits for adaptation and resilience. A chief example of that was something that Secretary Moore mentioned earlier, actually, which was strategic investment and conservation efforts. Doing that, for example, not only improves headwater storage, which reduces flooding, but it also increases our ability for our forests, for example, again, to sequester and store carbon, which gets us to our 2050 requirements within this Global Warming Solutions Act. Again, the good news is that much of what we're covering today falls squarely within this committee's purview. moving into the actual presentation, and Jared, thanks for sharing and continuing to drive this. The impacts of climate change, oh, go back, please. Just to get through this quick slide. As I said before, the impacts of climate change are already here. That is a key finding of both the National Climate Assessment and the 2021 Vermont Climate Assessment, which I'll get to a little bit more on the next page. Key findings of those, largely for the Northeast, but Vermont specifically, is that Vermont is getting both warmer and wetter. Our seasons are shifting. Most notable changes in our seasonal shifts are occurring in our winter months, and it's impacting all of Vermont's economic sectors. What else is happening? Increased precipitation and extreme weather events are already on the rise. We've seen nearly a triple-fold increase in the last decade in flood-related disasters in Vermont compared to the decade prior. And it costs over $10 million per year in taxpayers. And that's just for impacts to our public infrastructure. That does not include economic, private, small business, homeowner costs, et cetera. These impacts, as we know, will continue to worsen over the course of the next several decades, regardless of that necessary climate pollution reduction efforts. We also know that those impacts that we already are experiencing and that will continue to worsen are already felt and will be more heavily felt by disadvantaged, low income and rural Vermonters. So something that we should really be paying attention to. Addressing these impacts by promoting adaptive measures that build resilience. And again, with the resilience fatigue, if we're successful in building an adaptive and sustainable economy and environment, we will build a resilient Vermont across all of the sectors. It's critical to our long-term viability and success and ability to thrive in the decades ahead. And Secretary Moore spoke to this earlier, and I want to acknowledge it again, that unlike the very clear emissions reductions requirement through carbon dioxide in the Global Warming Solutions Act, we lack clear, measurable targets for adaptation and resilience. That is not a shortcoming of the Act necessarily, nor the General Assembly. That's a global community problem that we have. There is no agreed upon set of metrics to identify progress along adaptation and resilience efforts. Because of that, that was admittedly a challenge that the Climate Council, especially two subcommittees, Rural Resilience and Adaptation and Agriculture and Ecosystem, faced when trying to co-elevate the need to build in those adaptation and resilience policies, incentives, initiatives alongside pollution reduction efforts. That I think will probably be, oh, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a quick question?
Yeah, Senator Campion, please.
Ms. Oates, would you give me an example of what that might look like in terms of building in ways to measure adaptation? Because when I think of adaptation and resiliency, I think making certain that our bridges are up to code, making certain that we have protections when there's serious runoff. So it almost strikes me as a project list. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not sure if I'm thinking about it the right way, or if you have another way that you would measure that.
That's a great question. And it does, and you'll notice in a couple of chapters of this plan, it will feel like a project list.
Right.
Some things that we could do, however, if we wanted to actually have measurable targets, thinking off the cuff here. So sure. It won't be comprehensive, but making sure that we're increasing the number of safe, affordable housing. Safe meaning away and outside of our floodplains and river corridors. There is the 30 by 30 or America the Beautiful initiative that would set a clear target for the amount of lands and waters that we conserve over time. Those are two just quick examples of things that we could actually attribute clear metrics to and try to time bound them so that we can try to achieve them. But I see Jane's hand is up, so she might have more to add there.
I will put in the chat and follow up, but the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee did make an attempt to develop measurable goals around their specific pathways that they spoke to. So that is the section of the Climate Action Plan around building resilience and adaptation in our built environment and communities. There's a specific page that speaks to that and how we can build upon that further as we develop our measuring and assessing progress tool as required by statute. And so we will be working on that with not only that subcommittee, but ag and ecosystems as well as the full council.
And it sounds to me that some of these could be in both categories. In other words, we know that we have diminishing forests in the state. Keeping them whole will certainly help mitigate and sequester carbon, but also will build up our resiliency as it relates to how soils will handle runoff, that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Another metric that was discussed within the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee was also food insecurity, and acknowledgement that the pandemic especially exacerbated that. And I think we're officially at about 1 in 3 Vermonters being food insecure, and just acknowledging the close connection between a changing climate, our agricultural landscape, and access to safe, healthy food. Jared, I think you can go to the next slide. Oh, Chair
Can I ask a quick question, sort of expand on Senator Campion's question? So the last 2 things we've been talking about are sort of human-centered, like, but how about in your discussions, are you looking at rates of, well, it sounds a little, I don't know, highfalutin, I just won't edit myself. Extinction rates and loss of habitat, loss of species, does the plan put that non-human frame into the analysis as well?
We did, and we especially were concerned about that within the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. I believe, but I would lean on Jared and Jane to correct me if I'm wrong, that the guiding principles within the Just Transition Subcommittee also incorporated all species equity and inclusion, and the efforts that are undertaken by the legislature and future action on climate. I think I saw Jane nodding, so that's accurate too.
Okay, thank you.
So this next slide, trying to mirror some of Jared's data, but data for current climate trends within Vermont. These were again pulled from the 2021 Vermont Climate Assessment, which just came out a couple of months back. Again, key findings are largely that Vermont is getting warmer. In fact, we are already averaging annual increases of 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1990. So that's just within all of our lifetimes here. And we are also getting wetter by the tune of 7.5 inches per year additional annual rainfall since 1990. The graphs to the side there, they're probably pretty small, but the top is the number of warm winter days. And you can see those are over a course of decades since 1900. You can see a clear trend towards more warmer winter days. And the bottom is using the same decadal pattern from 1900. Observed annual precipitation. So that supports the warmer and wetter trends that we're experiencing, and will again continue to experience into the next several decades. Secretary Moore earlier mentioned that a lot of the plan is focused on flood resilience at present, since we are getting warmer and wetter, and the largest impacts that we're seeing for now are increased flooding. I did want to also acknowledge that we need to, as a collective community and members of different sectors in the Vermont community, plan for not just flood resilience and severe flooding, but increased incidence of drought, which seems a little counterintuitive, but that annual rainfall is actually occurring not just as more wet days, but more intense storms. And so those are punctuated by periods of drought, both of which impact a lot of our natural and working land sectors. We also will experience prolonged heat exposure, which is a huge human health impact, especially in our more urban areas, and increased occurrence of tick-borne diseases, invasive species, declined air and water quality, and the list unfortunately goes on, as you can imagine. As I mentioned, these changes are impacting communities and sectors across Vermont. This is not a comprehensive list, but it tries to mirror some of the chapters that you would find in the Vermont Climate Assessment, and different sectors that are kind of addressed throughout the Climate Action Plan. Jared, you can go to the next slide. So I think this is my last slide. That little graphic there is something that I've created to kind of try to quickly capture and convey the what I call the three-legged stool of comprehensively addressing climate change. Jared spoke to the need to reduce our carbon pollution. That should not and cannot be understated. We cannot miss the moment of our time. This next decade is incredibly important, that we need to be reducing our emissions in an extremely significant way. We also, while doing that, as I said, need to invest in policies, programs, and initiatives, incentives that improve our adaptation of our natural and working lands, that then, therefore, in turn, improve the ability of our human communities and built environment to withstand the climate impacts that are here and coming. And we also need to, as part of our mitigation efforts, acknowledge the role that our natural and working lands play in sequestering and storing carbon. That will be incredibly important over the course of the next decade when we have a shifting land base. Intergenerational land transfer is on the rise, as we have, I think Vermont is the second oldest, if not approaching first oldest state in the country. Nearly 80% of our land is privately owned. That means that there will be a huge transfer of land in the coming years. And what happens with that land is going to be incredibly important and will impact all three of these pillars. So being really intentional about that in our planning and our policy development is incredibly important. So as the General Assembly develops these solutions, I'd ask that you pay special attention to land use decisions and policies as necessary. Jared pulled out, and he admittedly did his part of our presentation first, so I tried to mirror his on my end. Largely policy-driven measures that you all. So I would definitely say keep a strong focus on the budget and the implications of the budget and how and where we're investing that. We have a long-form version of recommendations from the Climate Council on how we would love to see ARPA money spent, for example. But here are just a couple of policy measures from the Adaptation and Resilience, the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, as well as Agriculture and Ecosystems. One of the key cross-cutting themes that Secretary Moore mentioned earlier, and I'd love to elaborate on, is the importance of investing in compact settlement. That is one of the few strategies that was discussed in all three of the subcommittees of the Climate Council that were developing actions as critical to advance all three of these pillars. You can yield emissions reductions through decreasing vehicle miles traveled. You improve community cohesion. Our natural and working lands are more likely to be protected from urban and rural sprawl. We can create affordable, safe housing. The list goes on for all the boxes that compact settlement can check. So there's a whole section on that and what can be done there. I would love for you all to take a look at that and bring us all in if you would like to discuss that further. We also acknowledge the need through policy initiatives to reduce forest fragmentation, promote flood resilience through connected, intact, and protected river corridors and floodplains, and also to support investments in resilient infrastructure, upsizing our culverts, considering strategic abandonment of certain roads, things that can improve how we get around, not only in our towns and our communities, but also how we get around a changing climate and its impacts. I talked about, as did Secretary Moore, investing in strategic conservation, using Vermont conservation design as a guide for prioritizing those efforts. Per the formula and statute, fully funding Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and the regional planning commissions, that was brought up in both the Rural Resilience and Adaptation, as well as Agriculture and Ecosystem subcommittees. Something that is not fully fleshed out yet, admittedly, but as interesting perhaps to consider is the establishment of climate resilience zones, acknowledging that we have so many data sets that are available to us, climate trends, affordable housing areas, places that are really critical for habitat connectivity, and they haven't necessarily all been overlaid to really understand the safest, most appropriate places for human development and for necessary conservation. Two more things, and again, this is just a very short list, but I want to give time for the committee to ask questions. Developing required climate-based framework or criteria for state and regulatory programs. That would be a tool that could be effective across state governments, since each of the state agencies and their staff all have a hand to play in addressing climate change. And then finally, Senator Campion, you brought this up earlier, but acknowledging the role that soil health or regenerative agriculture can play, elevating and paying for those landowners and workers, both in farms and forests, who are doing those measures that are adaptive and resilient, and also protect and sequester and store carbon through payment of ecosystem services programs. And again, that's a short list. I think that's my last slide, even, Jared. You can keep it up if helpful, but happy to answer any questions there.
I'll ask you to keep an eye on our committee, and we'll invite you back in on the first two bullets, compact settlements and forest fragmentation, and the Act 250 bill we're doing goes directly to both those by trying to focus on facilitating smart growth, particularly with an eye on accelerating the rate at which we're developing housing and affordable housing. And also, while we're concentrating that development to then be more protective of and try to turn the tide on forest fragmentation. So. Can you say a little bit about the climate-based framework for state grant and regulatory programs? What I'm just trying to understand better what that would look like. Is this kind of a dashboard or a metric or a policy that gets consulted as programs get developed? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, great question. The part of the charge of the Climate Council and the respective subcommittees was to do perhaps some more informal inventory of existing state programs and policies that are already in place and doing a lot of good work to advance climate efforts, but that might be bolstered further through tweaking. And one thing that, especially within the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, we discussed was the opportunity for there to be, to leverage those existing programs, especially with respect to funding and regulation, that don't necessarily yet speak to climate, at least not directly, and use that as a leverage point to ensure that public funding and investments in our communities is trying to elevate or create co-benefits for climate. And that's something that doesn't necessarily exist. A lot of state programs are already doing that, grant programs, but just creating kind of a comprehensive required framework for that felt important to our subcommittee.
Okay. And on payment for ecosystem services, this gets into a big area, but how did you, or have you figured out a way to distinguish between services that are being delivered sort of above and beyond just good agronomic practices versus stopping damaging services? Like, you know, there are, for instance, I just watched about 40 acres of some of the most steeply pitched hayland in the area get harrow plowed last week. So it's going to be open ground right above a stream and a wetland for the entire winter and spring before anyone's back in there to do anything. So it's always a bit of a struggle to figure out what's worth paying for versus what's worth regulating and simply stopping.
You can imagine we definitely did have those conversations and debates, both for payment for ecosystem services, potentially for the agricultural community, as well as for the forester or forestry community. It's definitely a carrot and stick approach that would be necessary. And one example would be the required agricultural practices, which we discussed. I don't think we came to consensus on any specific recommendation, but that would be another one of those blending of those last two bullets of here we have existing regulatory frameworks and an opportunity to advance climate solutions through them, but needing to make sure that we're doing due diligence for the people who are actually managing and stewarding the land, paying them or incentivizing them to do the right thing, but making sure that we're having that regulatory backup to prevent further degradation through certain practices.
Did the council end up discussing at all, putting all water management under A&R? I mean, this is a little bit outside of exactly what you're talking about, but it's not really that far-fetched. It's you know, it's we've had a bifurcated system, and from certain perspectives, it has not served us well. And I'm just wondering if the council considered that, or it was beyond what you thought it was worth. I don't know. I shouldn't say worth discussing. You can't talk about everything. I don't know if you ruled that in or out for discussions in the committee.
That very specific solution was not discussed, but we did within the subcommittee obviously acknowledge the tension between the two agency system that we have in place to address water resources and water quality. There are a whole host of recommendations around improving water quality, improving existing programs, but that specific solution was not discussed.
Yeah, okay. All right. I don't know if there are any other questions from members of the committee, or if you, Ms. Oates, Mr. Duval, Ms. Lozorchek, we've spent most of 3 hours together this morning. I don't know if there's anything that you want to circle back to, highlight, or came up in our questions that suggests, something you want to leave us with. Mr. Duval.
Thank you, Chair Bray. I would just echo what Lauren said, that, if there's any follow-up or ways that I or we can be helpful as the session continues, please do not hesitate to reach out. I will also say that I can imagine that there are at least two really kind of important milestones that will be coming up in the future, which we would certainly want to share with you and have the chance to discuss. One will be once the final pathways analysis is complete and ready to share. I think it would be great for the council to be able to present, and the kind of team that has worked on that, to present and discuss that with you, because it gets into more detail about the pathways and strategies and actions and how they add up. And it includes, very importantly, a lot of information around economic analysis, both what this transition means for Vermont consumers and for the Vermont economy as a whole. I know you're going to be speaking with Joyce Manchester from the Joint Fiscal Office about the way that they have been approaching and assessing that. But I think that report will be a really important milestone with lots of important information to share and discuss. And then again, of course, once the council has gone through the process of assessing transportation policy recommendations and is ready to come back with a recommendation, make a revision to the initial plan to fill that TCI-sized hole, we would certainly want to do that. And I'm sure that there are many other kind of points along the way and opportunities that Jane and Lauren may want to mention. I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but those are two in particular that stand out.
Okay. When is the final pathways report anticipated to be published?
Yeah, I can speak to that. The Vermont Pathways report has been updated. The group working on that will meet to consider the final revisions next week. And then we anticipate presenting the final report to the cross-sector subcommittee on January 20th. So beyond that, it will be available for consumption by all of you and others. And I think digesting that and having a conversation about that will be really important, especially as it is the catalyst for us to also be thinking about further technical analysis that the council will want to be considering in the coming months and years. There is a section of that in the Climate Action Plan, and there is quite a bit of future work to be done. And specifically, since Jared mentioned it, around economics, what this modeling does not tell us is specific economic impacts of specific policy levers. And we will be talking about that with Joyce and further understanding our role in analyzing that. Especially, I know Chair Briglin has reached out to me yesterday around the Clean Heat Standard and starting to understand what the real cost and impact of those kinds of policies will be for Vermonters as we move forward with them. And just as far as other policy implications that feel relative to this committee that Jared didn't touch on, and we haven't spent a lot of time on, is the conversation around biomass. That was a very heated conversation at the council, and there were very specific actions that were tabled from the climate action plan that I'm really anxious for the subcommittees of jurisdiction to speak about and convene. That is both the cross-sector subcommittee and ag ecosystem, so both Lauren and Jared's subcommittees, to really dive into what those actions will look like, because I also believe that is a gap and a hole right now in the climate action plan, addressing and speaking comprehensively to biomass, and that feels very relative to this committee as well.
Well, you get best pun of the day by calling it a heated conversation. So
After a harrowing experience.
yes.
Which ought to be plowed under.
All right. Well, and let me just double check. I mean, was the debate over the issue of it's not necessarily carbon neutral, it's what kind of carbon cycle are you supporting when you use biomass? And I think that's one thing we've talked about in this committee. And the other thing is the emission of particulates.
Those were all considered how we think about it in our greenhouse gas inventory, the burning of wood, and then also got further into thinking about what we do with existing generation plants like McNeil and Rygate, as well as further expansion. So I expect there to be a robust conversation around those actions.
Okay.
If I may,
Please.
I would just also say I haven't seen, because I don't believe it's available yet, the budget request from ANR on behalf of the council in terms of budgeting for technical analysis next year. But I just really want to underline, especially as chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee, that we were able to either directly do or review the work of consultants, a large amount of work that really underpins this plan. But the thorniest, most complex of questions, like how we assess and track life cycle emissions in the electricity sector, or basically how we treat some of the emissions questions related to biomass, being able to have better, improved, more transparent and rigorous information about carbon storage and sequestration from soils and forests. Those are issues that are going to require, if we're going to get the answer, if we're going to answer them well, and to the satisfaction of, I think, the council and legislators and stakeholders, I would say, if anything, there is a need for more technical analysis funding in this second year of the council's operation than in the first, if we're going to be able to address those issues in a really thorough, careful way that helps inform careful, effective policymaking.
Right. Well, thanks for that reminder. And actually, that I've been saving a question. It was around, I wrote down council fatigue / capacity ? I know that you have a lot more work to do. And I think, some people have probably felt like this was more than they originally thought they signed up for, which reminds me of how legislators sometimes feel. So I would like to make sure that we support the council's continued work, and especially on something like data gathering, because if this committee keeps hewing back to science to try to make rational, well-informed decisions, particularly because there's controversy built into a lot of them, right? So we owe it to constituents to say we've consulted the science. The politics, everyone can land wherever they land, but let's get the science and the economics right to the extent we can. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With apologies, I'm expected at a noon meeting, and I'm going to be leaving this meeting.
Right.
I want to thank the witnesses. It was a good way to spend the morning. Very informative. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
signing off.
I do have a noon meeting. Thank you.
Senator McDonald, last question or remark to you, and then I hear the bell ringing.
I believe we were given a number of, there were 234 recommendations made, and I may have that number wrong. Was wondering if the climate change people had 234 soldiers to send out on this mission, to which of those 234 recommendations would they, how many soldiers would they allot to each one of those recommendations if they only had 234 soldiers? So we would know where to start our work to get the most done as quickly as possible, while we put others to those recommendations to the back of the line. And I haven't seen that in the report.
As you can imagine, Senator, I think you would get very different answers from all of the respective counselors. The prioritization process that we did go through was not comprehensive, and that's a really simple way to kind of like the dot exercise of where you put your money and or capacity resources. We didn't necessarily get to that, but again, I think that would differ counselor to counselor. And as we think about the next decade and the criticality of action during this decade, I really just want to hammer home the point about making sure that our short-term needs, the imminent action that is needed to be taken, doesn't spite whatever the saying is, chop our nose to spite our face. That we're looking at the long-term needs of our land, our natural and working lands, and the economy and the communities that it supports. So just as we're looking at these solutions, let's make sure that we're thinking about a sustainable long-term approach to climate action.
Okay.
Guess that's up to us then.
It's the beauty of being elected. So you get to make choices on behalf of others, and it's rarely as easy as anyone would ever like. But well, thanks so much for really helping us cover a lot of material, not just fast, but with plenty of depth. So it was a really great dive into the Climate Action Plan. And on behalf of the legislature, I'll just say thanks again to the council for all that work. It really lets us hit the ground running this session. So, and we have no